Hi everyone, hello and welcome to the Myland Institute at Queen Mary, University of London. My name is Farah Hussain, I'm a research fellow at MEI and I will be chairing our session today. We're delighted to have you here with us this afternoon for our panel discussion on the implementation of the Civic University concept in the UK. First, we'll hear from my colleague, Jonathan Slater, visiting professor at MEI, former permanent secretary at the Department for Education and author of the report on the findings of our research. Then we'll hear from our panel members. They will give us their reactions to the report and share their own thoughts on how the university sector can better connect with our communities. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat box or the Q&A function, and you can also tweet at us using @MylandInst. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Farah, and to everybody who has joined us. Thanks for coming along as well. So, look, why am I doing this? I've spent 35 years operating at the interface between policy and implementation, trying to make sure that policy is informed by the reality on the ground and then implemented well. First of all, British Rail in the days when that was public, then local government, then central government. And when I left the civil service, summer before last, I was just as interested as I'd always been in the question, but now I had the chance to explore it on my own terms, rather than from the perspective of whichever politician I was lucky enough to be working for. And so I approached two policy institutes near to where I live, one at King's College and the other Queen Mary's. They both were happy to bestow upon me a title that I don't deserve. Turns out if you're an ex-permanent secretary, they make you a visiting professor, whether you've got any academic prowess or not. Hooray. And with King's, I'm exploring the question about the effectiveness of Whitehall and Westminster and how to make it more so. But Queen Mary's asked me, it's Patrick Diamond in particular, who runs the Myland Institute. He said, this Civic University concept, that sounds really good, but I wonder what it's like in practice, what's actually going on the ground. And, not surprising that Queen Mary's would be interested in that question, because Queen Mary's has a proud history of engaging with local communities and the Myland Institute, as the name implies, very interested in the subject. And I thought, absolutely, why not? And I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to work with Farah, who is a researcher at Queen Mary's. And so off we went. We started by talking to colleagues at Sheffield Hallam University, because as some of you will know, Sheffield Hallam hosts a hub that supports the network of those universities who want to be civic universities, who have decided in response to a challenge laid down by the UPP Foundation back in 2018, 2019, that they would develop what's been called a Civic University Agreement. Over 60 such universities said they wanted to take up that challenge, and they get a bit of support from Sheffield Hallam. So Farah and I asked Sheffield Hallam if they would direct us to perhaps 10, round number, universities, at least one in Scotland, one in Wales, one in Northern Ireland, inevitably most of them in England, but to give us a bit of a spread of universities who are developing civic university agreements, so that we could get their views as to what the challenges they faced were and how we might help. In fact, Sheffield Hallam also helpfully suggested that the question that we might explore with those universities was how to measure impact, because what they were finding was that when they got together, universities at network meetings, that was one of the challenges that universities were all coming up with. How would you know whether any of the civic university activity is achieving anything positive on the ground? And how would you be able to distinguish the contribution that is made by the university from that made by the council or the health service or anybody else? Great question. So, all right, let's go and have a look. So off we went, and we ended up talking to 12 universities altogether. So not a sort of random sample, and only 12. So this is not a comprehensive survey of the whole territory, but nevertheless, 12 out of 60 or so, not a bad reach. And the question we were asking was, well, is this a problem for you, the measurement of impact? And have you got any good ideas that we could share with others? Or have you got any areas that you've got a particular problem with, and we can see if we could come up with any thoughts ourselves? So that was the conversation that we started. But what happened in every single one of the 12 interviews that we had was the conversation very quickly turned to something else. I mean, it's not that nobody had anything interesting to say about impact. And, we can all agree that it's not straightforward. But that wasn't really the presenting problem that Farah and I found in any of our 12 conversations. What we found in each case was somebody we were talking to is tremendously enthusiastic and committed to the importance of the role that their university would play locally. There's no doubting the enthusiasm of the people we were speaking to, and their commitment to make a difference, and their openness, and they were sharing papers and all the rest of it. That was, great, and you don't always get that. So that was very positive. But when it came to demonstrating what had been achieved, I mean, was there a Civic University Agreement that you could explore the question of its measurement or otherwise? Generally, no. Generally, no. Now, to be fair, UPP only pressed universities to produce these agreements, a couple of years ago, and there's a lot been happening in the intervening period since 2019. And so it may be that this is a sort of consequence of a moment in time. And if we come back in 2 years' time, we'll find the position is different. That's certainly possible. But we, of the 12 universities that we spoke to, we found one that had produced a Civic University Agreement of the sort that we were anticipating, of the sort defined by the UPP Foundation. They described it well, as following a strategic conversation between the university and its partners and local residents, a proper discussion about, well, what impact does the university want to have? To what extent does it need to work collaboratively with its partners, agree some actions, write them down, on you go. The UPP Foundation had concluded, of course, back in 2018, that there's lots of activity that many universities have been engaged in with a local impact for years and years and years. Some positive, some negative, obviously. But the challenge that the UPP Foundation was laying down was, for the university to grab hold of this with both hands and have a strategic conversation. What did it want its impact to be? There's not a right answer to that question. To what extent does University X want to have impact Y on its local area? And that would be a conversation owned at the top level and shared with the council, the NHS trusts, colleges, and the rest of it. We found not much evidence of that having happened at all yet. That means we may have been talking to the wrong universities, but we were talking to universities who we had been asked to speak to by the hub, who supports universities who have volunteered to do this activity. So that was the first thing that we were struck by. Enthusiastic people, but generally not having managed to get an agreement out there on the ground yet. We found one, as I say, which has since been published, met our definition of a Civic University Agreement, by which I mean that there was clear evidence that the university had spoken to partners. What did they want from the university? They had also asked the public, what did the public think in their locality of the university? What did they want of it? And then there'd been a conversation within the university about how they were going to respond. So to take one practical example, there was lots of demand from people, as turned out to be in Sheffield. They wanted Hallam to train more health professionals to stay in Sheffield after their training and improve the quality of the local health service. That's a well-defined objective. Sheffield Hallam decided they wanted to play, and they could play a much more significant role. So the university agreement commits them to doubling their output, which they couldn't do other than by agreement with the NHS locally. Big tick. That meets the definition for Farah and me of a strategic discussion. We didn't find evidence of that elsewhere yet for the universities that we spoke to. We found action. We found activity, but we didn't see strategic intent. Perhaps not surprising, if you've got one or two enthusiastic people, they obviously don't have typically the authority, the reach, the seniority to drive such a strategic conversation. Maybe a moment in time, maybe that's, as we move out of COVID, that the conversation will change. But that's the main conclusion that we reached, was that, the question of how you might measure impact only really arises once you've had the strategic conversation about what it is you want to achieve and what your partners think. And we did actually find interesting practice of how you can measure impact. We didn't actually think that the sort of quantifying task was going to be the particularly hard one. I mean, obviously it's not straightforward to isolate the impact of one partner over another when it comes to what you're doing to raise standards in schools. But in a way, so what? If the university commits to making a difference to GCSE standards, say, in the local area, and has got an action plan to do so, fair enough. But what we didn't find at this stage in the process was much evidence of that sort of strategic conversation taking place. So that is our sort of key conclusion. We felt that there seemed to be a lot of support for the principle of a Civic University Agreement back in 2018-19. As I say, over 60 universities said they wanted to do it. It seems like a very good thing. Why wouldn't you want each university to consider its role in its locality and decide what it's going to do about it? Half of student fees are not paid by the students, as we all know, in practice, in the end. So there are any number of reasons why that's a good thing to do, but we didn't find much evidence of that happening yet. Not difficult to speculate as to why. There have been all sorts of difficulties with the pandemic for universities to deal with. There's no money in it. There's all sorts of financial incentives on universities to focus elsewhere, maximize the number of international students, to take one obvious example. You don't get much credit for it, if any, from the Office of Students. But on the other hand, I remember when the legislation was going through, this will be my final comment, on the regulation of university tuition fees and the creation of Office of Students, there was a big debate in the House of Lords, and the institutional independence of universities was, a hard-won battle. Congratulations. The government isn't in control of universities still. That's a good thing. It raises the question, this to me and to Farah, well, look, universities themselves said they wanted to do this thing. They're not being told to do it. They don't get extra cash for doing it. They want to do it because it's the right thing. Is that enough? You've got to hope so, but at the moment, it's not clear. Back to you, Farah.
Thanks, Jonathan. And for anybody who signed up in advance for the event, you should have been sent the report this morning via email. So now we'll move on to the panel discussion. And firstly, we'll hear from Kerslake, who is Chair of Peabody, Sheffield Hallam University, the New Economics Foundation, and 2 regeneration agencies in East London and Stockport. So a very busy man. He is Vice Chair of the Local Government Association, and he chaired the UPP Foundation Independent Commission into the civic role of universities. So over to you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Farah, and thank you to Jonathan for initiating this piece of work. Actually, I find it a very enjoyable read, and I think a useful challenge actually at this point in the process of developing Civic University Agreements. So pleased that the work's been done, and it is, I would recommend to those who are on the call, if you haven't read it, do have a read on it. I think what I'd like to do start with is to just say a bit about the Commission itself and how we came to the idea of Civic University Agreements in the work that we did, and then talk a bit about sort of the findings that you've come out with. The Commission was an independent commission. It was an influencing commission. That's to say we had no power. We weren't commissioned by government to do the report, or indeed by the sector. It was funded by the UPP Foundation, and it was a cross-sector commission where we went around the country and tried to survey the evidence for ourselves, if you like. We have business and other representatives on the commission. The exam question was really looking back at the history of universities. Many, if not most, had their origins in the civic role, supported by the local place. And was that still a relevant factor in today's world for universities, given the move towards a more marketized model, let's call it that for the moment? And the answer we found was definitively yes. Places most definitely needed their universities, and we felt that universities needed their places as well going forward. There was, as Jonathan said, a lot of enthusiasm about the sorts of activities that they were doing at the moment, but very little evidence of strategic thinking or engagement with those communities in developing their priorities. And interestingly, we did a piece of survey work. We found locally people were very proud of their university, but when you push them further to say why they were proud, what they were proud of, the answer came back much less clearly. And in particular, there was a difference between those in, let's say, social classes D and E to those in A and B. So there was a difference amongst the communities as well. The approach that we came up with was very much one of self-improvement, if you like, sector improvement. So we wanted to create, if you like, a movement, a civic university movement, and then develop a mechanism by which universities could undertake that strategic analysis, consult, and then come up with an agreement that was signed up to by all parties, and with some clear outcomes and outputs that they will be able to be measured against. So it was a means to an end, a civic university agreement, a process by which you could come to a clear strategic intent for your civic work. And I'm pleased to say there was A, very big buy-in to the report, and B, very big buy-in to the idea of civic university agreements as well. We did think about other ways in which you might move forward on this. So you might look at, let's say, the government directing the civic university agreements, making it a mandatory thing and regulating it in some way. Absolutely cut across the kind of university independence that people have talked about. And not always a way of motivating and getting local initiative. And also, I think we were very clear, we didn't want a one-size-fits-all approach. We wanted to have agreements that reflected the place. I think the second thing we explored was, should it be about money? Money talks, as they say. Should there therefore be a financial incentive? Well, we did propose a very modest financial incentive in the scheme of things. But in truth, was there an appetite, and Jonathan will vouch for this, I think, to put a lot more money into the higher education sector at that point? I think not. And so it had to be one that wasn't wholly driven by a financial incentive. So what we came up with, in a way, was very much one that the sector could adopt and do for itself, really, and take forward as its own initiative. Now, what I think Jonathan's report, and Farah's report, I should say as well, it tells us is that the progress has been perhaps slower than you would have hoped, given the time that we've had since we published the report. And I do know that other agreements have been completed and published, because I've been invited to many of the launches of them. But you'd still say we would have hoped for more. There are extenuating circumstances. We have had the small matter of a pandemic, and the impact on universities of that has been, of course, like everybody else, very profound. So there are, as I say, reasons why it's taken longer. But I think you do also point to some interesting issues that are worth exploring on this. Firstly, the sense in which the person leading the agreement is very much on their own doing the report. They're enthusiastic, but is there the sponsorship at the senior level in that university? And I'm pleased to say the one that has completed, got over the line, and gets a fairly positive billing in your report is none other than Sheffield Hallam University. So thank you for that. But I think the key point there is it had senior sponsorship through Richard Calvert, one of the DVCs in the university, and senior sponsorship through the board as well, through one of the board members. So I think there's a really important issue here about not allowing one person to have to take on the whole burden of it, and not having that senior sponsorship and ownership really at the same time. I think the second point I would make is that there is not a shortage of enthusiasm in universities for this agenda, I think. What I think there often is a lack of capacity to engage with communities to find out what they think. We did some survey work. Of course, there's a cost to that, but I think it's an essential part of the whole idea of civic university agreements, that you don't presume you know what is important to the community, you actually ask them. And I think that's been a bit of a barrier of people saying, can we justify the investment we need to make to do that? Well, my view is you have to. My third thought really is that the hub, which we host in Sheffield at Hallam, should be a way in which best practice can be shared and people can work with each other to overcome some of the challenges of civic university agreements. I think that has been the case. We've got something like 70%, 115 universities in the group. So that's, I think, a hell of a start here. But I think it could go further, and you could look at a model that's worked very well in local government, which is a peer review model. So universities go to each other and actually do a testing and challenging about how far they've gone and how they've approached it. It would have to be a voluntary model, invited in, but actually I think it could be a very powerful way of ensuring that, in a sense, the progress that's made is a more consistent progress across the sector. Two final points really I'll make on ways in which we can get more consistency and progress, I think. I do think that stronger signalling from government is important here about the civic role, not in a sense of direction. I don't think any of us particularly want that, but in the sense of the relative priority of the civic role. Everybody gets the importance of teaching and learning and research, but for me, the civic role is the third arm here. It should be integral to the way the university works. And I think, in a sense, government signalling more strongly that that's what they would look to and want from our universities, and their active contribution, of course, to the levelling up agenda, I think would be a very, very powerful message to the sector. And then just finally, I think some money, a little money, would go a long way here. I do think carving out, as we suggested, something like £500 million to support those universities who are prepared to go the extra mile on this agenda would make a difference, and a significant difference out of all proportion to the amount of money that is involved. Am I disheartened by your report? No, I'm not, because I can see that the ambition and the enthusiasm for the agenda is there. Do I think there are some important lessons to learn about how we can make quicker progress and more sure-footed progress across the sector without moving away from that guiding principle of local leadership and voluntary commitment? I think, yes, there is actually. And I think this should be used, I think, as a starting point for that sort of conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Alexis Brown. Alexis is Director of Policy and Advocacy at HEPI. Prior to joining HEPI, she was a policy manager at the Russell Group, where she managed a portfolio of policy issues relating to higher education, skills and funding. She holds a PhD from the University of Oxford in English literature, and she was a Rhodes Scholar there and has taught at the University of Oxford and University of Sheffield. Over to you, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Farah, and thank you so much for this report. It was a really, really interesting read, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start off by just saying that I think the work that Mile End Institute and Queen Mary is doing is so important. When I was working at the Russell Group, Queen Mary consistently stood out among our members as a university that was doing such exceptional work in reaching out to its surrounding community. And I was really pleased to see the latest IFS report on social mobility reflect this. I think Queen Mary performed at a rate of 6.8%. when the average for universities was 1.3, which is really astonishing and impressive. So congratulations on that. Today, I just wanted to link Jonathan and Farah's report to two HEPI reports, one that's come out recently and another that's coming out next week. The first of these is a report that we did with the UPP Foundation over the summer that explored public attitudes towards universities. A lot of the answers that we found were surprising, and I think they offer a lot of perspective on how the general public thinks about the role of universities in their lives and communities. The good news coming out of the report is that public attitudes towards universities are not as negative as you might think, given some of the culture war issues that are constantly in the news. It showed that 43% consider universities' impact to be positive, while only 11% considered it to be negative. So almost 4 times as many people think that universities' impact is positive than do negative. But I think even more interestingly, almost half, 46%, feel neutral about universities. They don't really have any strong feelings about universities at all. And that means that there's a lot of middle ground here for the taking. And that's where I think civic universities can come in to bridge that gap and get that neutral half of the community involved in their local university. And another interesting finding from this report, I think one reason why so many people can feel neutral towards universities is that they may simply never have visited one. Our report found that 34% of people surveyed had never visited a university ever. So you can understand why they might not feel necessarily one way or another towards the university in their area. And that begs the question of how do we build those links between universities and their surrounding communities? We have a report coming out next week from Richard Brabner, director of the UPP Foundation, called One Nation Universities, and it puts forward several ideas for how universities could become better integrated into their surrounding communities. One of the measures he talks about that I wanted to draw particular attention today was his idea that the UK implement a program similar to AmeriCorps in the States. And I think this is really an interesting idea. You've probably not heard of AmeriCorps before, but it's essentially a service program in the US run through an independent government agency, almost like a domestic Peace Corps, that takes often students, but also others, and puts them to work in their community, doing things like early childhood education, conservation work, even disaster relief, especially during COVID. What I like about this model, and where I think it matches up with some of the best practice described in Jonathan Fair's report, is firstly that it's strategic and it's targeted towards the community's specific needs, which, as this report points out, is crucial for success. But secondly, this program also mines the available resources within universities in their local areas. For example, students with free summers on their hands who may need a summer job. And to give an example, I actually did AmeriCorps when I was undergraduate in Madison, Wisconsin. For context, Madison is one of the most segregated cities in America. Bits of it, where the university is, are fairly well off, but large parts of it are also deprived and have been historically. So for a summer, as part of this program, I rode the bus every morning to an elementary school in the outskirts of Madison, where I helped teach a summer school to kids that had been identified as being at risk of falling behind in school. So teaching them basic literacy and math skills. And the whole program only lasted 8 weeks or so, but the advancements that the kids made in those couple of weeks was just astounding. And at the end of the summer, they were much better prepared for the coming school year than they would have been otherwise. The program also, and I think this is crucial, created a kind of symbiotic relationship between the community and the university in Madison. University students like me who engage in these kinds of programs are getting work experience, they're exploring potential new career paths, they're getting paid through educational stipends, in addition to giving back to their communities. Over something like 270,000 people have served in over 40,000 communities across America in different AmeriCorps programs. And I raised this example here in this context, I guess, to be a bit provocative and ask whether, rather than universities individually being tasked with coming up with civic university agreements, whether it might not make a bit more sense to centralize more of this effort. Maybe not through, say, a government agency per se, but through some kind of more centralized effort that coordinates and capitalizes on shared values and ambitions across the sector to keep things from becoming piecemeal, as I think we can find in some of these initiatives when it tends to be just 1 or 2 people who are very enthusiastic, but might not be supported through a larger structure that, as Bob has pointed out, also needs to have more funding. And AmeriCorps also has an extremely robust impact evaluation framework, which I think part of the value there in sharing and centralizing some of this effort is coming up with those kinds of robust evaluation frameworks that can then be shared across a variety of contexts. But I also want to emphasize that this approach and any attempt at integrating universities more into their communities is not without risk. I think it's important to be mindful of the sometimes unbalanced power dynamics at stake that can emerge in some of these collaborations, and that these need to be accounted for and worked through. And that brings me to the final point I wanted to touch on. Jonathan, you touched briefly in your report on this, and that's the fact that not all universities are necessarily welcomed by local people. This is something that you said universities tended not to mention in your conversations with them, but it is something that I think maybe we should linger on a bit more in the discussion, because for all of the good that universities can bring to their communities, they can also create issues of noise, pollution, they can increase rental prices, potentially create housing issues. These aren't insurmountable issues and they can be managed, but we do need to have honest conversations about them. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alexis. Our third speaker is Ben Rogers. Ben is Bloomberg Policy Fellow in Government Innovation at LSE Cities and Professor of Practice at University of London. Since taking up his position at University of London, he has set the agenda for the London Research and Policy Partnership, which brings together London policymakers and academic researchers to tackle London's critical challenges. Over to you, Ben.
Great. Thank you. Well, I mean, first of all, I welcome this report, just like I welcome the Bob's initial report. I'm new to the university world, the academic world, but I'm a big enthusiast for this agenda. I hope I'm not one of those enthusiasts that Jonathan talks about who are enthusiastic without much effect. We will see. But I remember first coming across the concept of an anchor institution about 10 years ago, an American concept, and it immediately sort of struck me as being a really helpful, insight into the sort of role that these big employers, investors, and purchasers can play in a place. And it's a concept that doesn't come that naturally to government and policymakers who tend to think in terms of policy. And this isn't about policy. This is about actually partnership. It's about getting your big institutions, your big local organizations on side, developing a working relationship with them, and getting your priorities and objectives to align with theirs. And that takes a sort of slightly different way of doing government. So as I say, I'm an enthusiast for this. I'm just going to talk a bit about the London scene, because obviously the London scene is in some ways sort of peculiar to itself, just because London is such a big city, and it never stopped reminding people it's bigger than Scotland and Wales combined, and a couple of dozen universities, and a very pretty complicated two-layered governance structure. So I just sort of reflect a bit about how this is sort of playing out in London, and I'm going to order my comments very brief, I hope, just under three headings. The first is about sort of civic university movement itself, if I can call it that. So the UPP report and related work has certainly focused minds in London and spurred activity. So Queen Mary, which is the hosting today's event, is the London lead within the Civic University Network, and has led in setting up a London-wide Civic University Forum. This has met a number of times over the last 18 months and is focusing on sharing good practice and building working relationships between individuals who have responsibility for civic engagement or civic strategies or civic university agreements in London universities. It's open to anyone to join. And it's very much about just creating a space for people to share their progress on developing a civic strategy, ask questions and get support. At the same time, London Higher, which is the sort of membership body of all the universities in London, has set up a Civic University Network, which has a sort of slightly different membership, but has not been without challenges in terms of duplication. As I said, London is complicated, but the Civic Network is more focused on raising the profile of London's universities' sort of work in this area, and identifying key policy issues that we may wish to engage on as a membership body. So there's the sort of Civic University Network, then there's the Civic University Forum, which is run by Queen Mary, and then there's the London Higher Civic University Network, and that is actually publishing a map next week, just showing, illustrating some of the things that London's universities already do. My sense is that the Civic University sort of agenda, as I'm describing it, and as it's emerged from the UPP report, is quite locally focused. So it's very much about what's going on at the sort of borough and the neighbourhood and the sort of community level. And that's what the map that's being published, the Civic University map next week, I think, is going to be about. One I guess issue with that in London is that universities are spread very unevenly across the city. And so you get these sort of hot spots. I mean, Bloomsbury, I'm sitting here at the LSE today. Yesterday I was at Senate House, got the most incredible concentration of academic firepower. And then you get to Waltham Forest and they haven't got a university at all. So we do need to think, about how we sort of coordinate those. So that's what's going on at the sort of Civic University agenda. But then another part of the forest, there's a sort of different sort of movement, more related but different, which is around anchor institutions. So this is something which has really come out of the mayor and London councils in response to the pandemic. Early on in the pandemic, the mayor and the council set up a London Recovery Board, which was obviously to help London recover from the pandemic. It quite quickly identified the important role that London's big employers, commissioners and so on could play in helping address issues like unemployment that we were expecting to result from the pandemic. And they initiated an anchor institutions charter, which they invited all of London's big organizations to sign. And that happened about a year ago. And the universities signed that, signed by Wendy Thompson, who's the Vice Chancellor of the University of London, my boss, on behalf of the members of the University of London, but I think also more broadly on behalf of all the universities in London. Wendy's also on the London Higher Board and is chair of the London Higher Civic University Network. So she brings all these things together. And incidentally, I'll just mention very quickly that she's also formerly, like Bob, a local authority chief executive. And she's very, very signed up to that agenda. So perhaps one of the lessons is if you really want the state identity pushed forward, make sure that you've got a chair and or a chief executive effectively who've come from that background. The Recovery Board set up then an anchor institutions steering committee, and that is sort of pushing forward very actively 4 or 5 work streams and asking the signatories of the anchor institutions charter to sort of actually sort of make numerical commitments as to what it's going to do across areas like recruitment and skills, mentoring of young people, Green New Deal, purchasing strategy, making sure that we're buying services and goods from smaller London-based businesses, particularly those with a sort of SME leadership. That a bit like the Civic University movement itself is going at different paces. I mean, some organisations are pretty active, others less so. But there's going to be a big. We've got the launch of the Civic University map on Monday, I think that's right, and then there's a big anchor institutions conference being held at Senate House on Tuesday. The mayor will be speaking at it, and that's bringing together all of London's civic big organisations. And then the third bit, I'm just going to say 2 words about this, is the thing that I'm leading on, which is the London Research and Policy Partnership, which is a partnership which we launched last summer, which aims to bring together and promote joint working between London policymakers, London government on the one hand, and London's academic research community on the other, on the grounds that this is clearly a sort of massive opportunity. It is sort of crazy that we haven't had this before. You've got London government, which is sort of facing running a city which faces sort of huge challenges and is pretty strapped for cash, and then you've got this amazing powerhouse of research expertise. There are all sorts of informal, relationships between the two, and then there's lots of, there's lots of, issues, where they work together. But what we don't have is something which can really, in a coordinated way, match policy priorities and the work that policymakers know needs to be done with the interests and expertise of researchers. And this is clearly a sort of win-win relationship. It's clear what's in it, I think, for the policymakers, which is they get to draw on the expertise, like academic expertise, but it's also, I think, clear what's in it for the researchers, which is they get access to government leaders and policymakers, and in that way, I think, get to sort of solve real problems. So that's where we are. I think in terms of sort of I guess the big point that Farah and sort of Jonathan made about the fact that this is all moving quite slowly. I would say, first of all, I wouldn't make having a university, a Civic University Agreement, sort of sole test bed of what's going on. I mean, if I think about what sort of UCL are doing with Camden and in the Olympic Park, they're really engaged in supporting their local community, even if they're not yet, as far as I'm aware, launched a Civic University Agreement. I think that Goldsmiths have launched their Civic University Agreement. I know Queen Mary are in the process of developing one, so things are happening there. But I think the conversation partly as a result of what Bob and others have done, partly as a result of what the Mayor is doing and the Recovery Board with the Anglican Institutions Charter. The conversation has noticeably changed in the last few years, and I'm hopeful it will keep moving forward.
Great, thank you, Ben. So we have 2 questions in the Q&A. So one from Emily. She has asked a question about the panel's thoughts on the pros or cons of fast production of civic agreements versus slower engagement. And even though we found little evidence of strategic, oh, there's an echo. Okay, it's gone. Civic impact. It may be because it takes time to do this well, because you're bringing together external, multiple partners, internal and external, and that just takes time. And then additionally, getting senior buy-in within the organization also takes time. And to launch something that's sustainable and institutionally supported takes even longer. So were myself and Jonathan fair to have expected more at this stage? So that's the first question from Emily. Second question from Jonathan is around the democratic accountability of local communities. So in some communities, so he speaks that he's from an area of Sheffield where people don't necessarily vote, they don't feel like they have a voice, and they're at the mercy of charities who basically, or I think the gist of it is that they use people in deprived areas for their own agendas. And he says that the last thing that we need is universities to do the same thing as these charities that work in these areas. So if I could throw those 2 questions over to you first of all, and then hopefully we'll get a few more through. Maybe we'll start with Alexis.
Sure, thanks, Farah. Yeah, on the first question, I think it's a really good question. There's so much, there can be so much bureaucracy within large universities when it comes to agreeing kind of any kind of strategic vision. It can be a nightmare. And it does also take time to build relationships with the local community. These can't emerge out of nowhere. They take years to develop and come to fruition. And so, yeah, maybe it's not fair to have expected more at this stage. But I don't think that should stop us from thinking about how we can be strategic going forward. And on the second question as well, yeah, this is kind of what I was touching on it towards the end of my bit. I think it can be really difficult to engage, especially deprived communities, in a way that is appropriate and that's serving them. And it's something that any university trying to work in this space has to be really cognizant of. Are they serving, the needs of those around them, or are they just doing something because they feel like they need to be doing something? And that, I think, has to emerge from, relating to the first question, longstanding partnerships and in-depth engagement that takes place over a long period of time and can never be kind of tokenistic.
Ben.
Yes, on the do we want to move fast or go slow and go deep? Probably go slow and go deep. I mean, as I've already said, I'm encouraged by the nature of the conversation that we're having in London, by the seniority of the people who are engaged in it. Not just my vice chancellor, but there are now some senior vice provosts or their equivalents for London, where there weren't, I think, 10 years ago. That's that's an indication that this has moved up the agenda. And as I've said, I think there is lots of activity going on already, even if it hasn't been sort of corralled and organised under a Civic University agreement. I mean, look, on the democratic legitimacy front, I do hope that our elected leaders have some democratic legitimacy, and they don't have it. I don't know who has it, and they certainly need to be around the table and sort of leading this conversation. As far as out-of-touch academics are concerned, actually, we are. I look at the academics that I know working on London issues in London's universities. Most of them are very attuned to the need to sort of engage and work with local communities. There's lots of sort of participatory research going on in London's universities, the use of citizens' juries and things like that. So I mean, I think it was certainly something we should attend to. We should worry about, but I don't sort of recognise in the research I know that's going on in London, out of touch academics.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. I think good questions. The first point about time really is a good one, and I think a number of universities have chosen to invest time in building alliances, building coalitions, asking the community, and that means that it's taking them longer to get to their agreement. I think that is absolutely true. And the last thing I would have wanted was people to literally come out with one and say, here's one I prepared earlier, because that is not what we were talking about. The thing that worried me most when I did this commission was that people would say, well, we're doing this already, so there's nothing to change here. It did require genuine engagement with stakeholders and with communities to get it right, really. And I think COVID has impacted on that timescale, unquestionably. Universities have had to make huge changes in the way they deliver teaching and learning in this period. So that has had some impact on time and availability and so on. The risk, though, is that if the process just takes too long, you lose some energy and momentum here, and you also delay the point at which you can have your full impact. So there's a balance to be struck here. But yes, I think it is fair to say that on the whole, we were looking for investment in coalition building and consultation before people got to the agreement. And as I think Jonathan said, or indeed is in the report, we've only just finished ours at Hallam, actually. It's only very recently we completed the work. I think on the question of communities, universities are kind of one part of a dislocation between different communities and the governing and the governed, basically. There's a much bigger agenda there for all public institutions. But I think there are good examples where universities have positively engaged and made a real impact. And I pick out, for example, initiatives that Manchester have done and we've done in Sheffield Hallam to work with local schools in deprived areas and introduce the potential to go to universities. Alexis said a lot of people don't even think universities are for them or connected to them. And I think making that very positive connection from a primary age is really, really important. And just one last point I'd make. Alexis talked about the potentially disruptive effects of universities on the ground. And I think you're right about that. When I said to my wife I was doing this review, her first comment was, well, I hope they're going to sort the parking out for the university. And I actually think that some American universities have got this right, and they produce what they call good neighbor agreements that attend to the the kind of day-to-day stuff, as well as that bigger kind of visionary piece. I think you probably need to do a bit of both, actually. And I like the idea of good neighbour agreements as well as civic agreements, or even as part of them.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Thanks very much. So I'm totally up for a university deciding wants to spend 5 years, 10 years developing a civic university agreement, and it's got a really carefully thought through plan. It's going to spend the first 3 years making sure that it really reaches out to people who haven't the faintest idea what university is, and it's going to resource that, etc., etc. I'm certainly not arguing, and neither is Farah, that it's got to be done in a hurry. And I suppose if the 12 universities that we've spoken to had shared their 5-year plans, we'd have produced a report saying, you know, we're halfway in, and in 2.5 years' time, we'll have 12 really good, thoughtful, you know, community-based civic university agreements. But that is not what we found. We did find some universities, and Emily, you know, since you are from Queen Mary's, and you'll know that we've reported positively in the report on some work that you've been doing that you know much more about than I do, but you shared with us very helpfully, in which you have been definitely, I absolutely can see it, reaching out to really try and get to the bottom of what the actual impact of the university currently is and what people want. And so, you know, great. And that could indeed lead to a really rich agreement. And whether you call it agreement or not, as Ben says, and we say this in the report, it doesn't really matter, really. You know, are you having a strategic conversation about what you want to achieve, and, you know, do something about it? And I can see how that might be the case at Queen Mary's, and it might be the case at some others too. So it's not speed we're looking for, but we didn't really. It wasn't that people were saying to us, "We haven't got one yet because we're 2 years into a 4-year plan." That was not what people were telling us. I mean, maybe universities are more organic institutions than that, but, you know, anyway, I hope that answers that question. It is possible to do one in the time frame because Sheffield Hallam did it. It would be possible to spend longer at it doing it even better. But I think the challenge that we're laying down to the sector is, if you want longer, then, you know, you need to have a plan. And I would also say, as Bob does, I mean, you know, this would be true not just of civic university agreements, sort of anything big and significant. If your pitch is, we'll come back to you in 5 years' time with something, then people are going to lose interest in the intervening period. Hence the notion of quick wins, you know. I'm not the first person to make this point, but if that is your intention, to change things in 5 years' time, work out what you can do more quickly so that people don't lose interest on the way. And then on the second point, I mean, yes, the very first conversation I ever had with Sheffield Hallam, which was before I did this piece of work, I was a bit amazed, really, that the university itself was sort of taking on the role that I would have previously anticipated was the local authorities' role. After all, you know, the councils are elected. I mean, you've pointed out, Jonathan, that a lot of people don't vote, but at least they have some democratic legitimacy, as Ben says. You know, of course, Sheffield Hallam's chair of government is the ex-chief executive of the council. So not surprising, as Ben says, why the university might be interested in this agenda. The crucial thing is the university should recognise what its legitimacy is and what it isn't. And there are plenty of people, again, as other panelists have said, in universities who are frankly a lot more connected into local communities than some bureaucrats or even some politicians. It's possible, Jonathan, that you might even think of yourself as one such person. Sounds to me you're a researcher at Sheffield. So it is possible for universities to connect in effectively, isn't it? But to do so openly and not to claim the space in which they get to decide what's right for the city. That would be completely wrong. They don't have that democratic legitimacy at all. But to ask themselves, what is our impact at the moment? And ask other people what their impact is and what do you want to do about it? And final comment, we were very struck by the fact that whenever we asked the question, and we did each time, what is the negative impact you have in your local community and what are you doing about that? On 11 out of 12 conversations, the people looked at us like, wow, we've never thought about that question. And now that's partly the people we were speaking to. They are enthusiasts to develop, wanting to develop a civic university agreement, but the sort of mindset that comes with that is, you know, universities are good. They can have a really fantastic impact on the local community, and of course those things are both true, and you would be unlikely to work in such a role if you thought that your university was a wholly negative thing. But it was quite striking that in 11 out of 12 cases, certainly the people we've spoken to, had not really thought about the parking or the rubbish or the noise or the housing. And we only found one example, which we highlighted because we thought it was, as Bob has said, Bob Kerslake saying, you know, an important question for institutions to ask themselves.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we've run out of time for questions, but there are a few more comments in the chat box, which I encourage all the panelists to take a look at before the meeting ends. So thank you to all of our speakers, to everyone who posted questions, and to all of you for coming to this lunchtime webinar. You can find out more about the Mile End Institute at qmul.ac.uk/MEI, where you can sign up to the mailing list and find out more about past and future events. The report will also shortly be up on the website, and as I said, anybody who registered for the event in advance should have a copy already in their inbox. So thank you again to everyone for coming this afternoon and for taking part in this vitally important discussion. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.